So today we're going to be discussing how the Prudential Day One Funds combat inflation, a specific type of inflation that retirees face that's different and higher than those of us in the workforce face simply by virtue of the basket of goods that they buy. But I think a lot of advisors and consultants would say, hey, inflation is not really that much of a problem. So Shri, maybe you can shed some light on why inflation is a challenge for retirees and how it should be addressed.
I think quite simply, Pete, because we know these cycles never last. Both markets and inflation go through periods of time when they're low and when they're high. And when you think about a retirement horizon that's 15, 20, 25 years, even a 3% incremental inflation can cut your purchasing power in half. Now add to that what you just said. The basket of goods that participants buy in retirement is vastly different than what many of us buy. Coupled with that, the standard inflation measure that we use doesn't actually include energy or food, the basics of what most people consume, let alone healthcare, which has been outpacing inflation for a number of years. So when you put all those together, if you don't have investments that can help keep up with inflation that you're going to experience in retirement, you're going to have a significant erosion of your purchasing power over your lifetime.
One could make also the case that retirees are held hostage because they're not in the workforce and they can't draw on wages, and perhaps even that problem is compounded by the fact that Social Security is adjusted based on CPIW, an inflation measure that's been lower than the sort of inflation that retirees have faced. So we understand that it is a pressing problem for retirees. The question is, how do we combat it? So Jeremy, from an investment perspective, what is being done with the Day One Funds glide path to combat inflation?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things we can do with the glide path. I mean, one thing I'll mention before is, Shri hit it on the head. I think the key term is purchasing power, right? I mean, if you ask any participant what's the risk in their portfolio, they're not going to say standard deviation. They don't care about what standard deviation is or what a Sharpe ratio is. They care about, well, the risk to my portfolio is that I'm going to run out of money. I'm going to have money to pay my bills, right? My rent, my grocery store bills, whatever that may be. That's the risk to a participant. So that's the way we think about it. And Shri mentioned it a couple times, purchasing power. So our goal with the glide path there is preserving purchasing power for these individuals in the glide path. And so how do we do that? Well, I think we do that by making shifts within the portfolio as these funds are in retirement and move through retirement to more inflation hedging asset classes. And by inflation hedging asset class, I'd say specifically U.S. inflation hedging asset classes, right? So I think the most common are sort of real return asset classes you hear people talk about. TIPS, commodities, real estate, all of those tend to hold up very well in high inflationary environments, both sort of relative to the rest of sort of all of their peers, other asset classes, as well as sort of relative to themselves. They tend to perform best when inflation goes up. And so the goal there is when inflation goes up, my bills go up, I want my portfolio to hold up. So by investing in some of these asset classes, I'm going to hopefully help that portfolio to perform a little bit better. In addition, you'll see shifts in the portfolio towards with more of a U.S. bias, right? We want things that sort of adjust to U.S. inflation. If inflation overseas is very, very low, but inflation in the U.S. is very high, that's what I care about as a U.S. investor. And so we'll make those shifts for a more U.S. bias, more inflation hedging asset classes and things like that to help really truly preserve the purchasing power of the portfolio.
So when the greatest risk that participants face, people who are in retirement, is inflation, a very specific sort of inflation because of the basket of goods that they buy. The Day One Funds hedge that risk by overweighting asset classes that do well when inflation is high. And those asset classes again are?
Real estate, both public and private, commodities, TIPS are some of those sort of key asset classes. And I think to some of those asset classes you'll see within retirement, the Day One Funds, as much as a 40% allocation to some of those real return asset classes.
So we address the right risks at the right time when that risk poses the greatest threat to somebody's retirement.